everyone, welcome to Deep Dives with Dogs. Well, today we're going to talk about the Battle of the Coral Sea in the Pacific Theater, and I'll bring up some other things as well in that, but it's mostly focused on the Battle of the Coral Sea. So the Battle of the Coral Sea starts May the 4th, 1942. It is kind of more of a defensive battle for the Allies against the Japanese to prevent them from taking Port Moresby on New Guinea. The Japanese had planned to land ground forces and use naval power to capture the port, which would then allow them to do further missions further closer to further inland to Australia eventually. And that is their eventual goal, to invade Australia. It never happens, but they get pretty close. But the Battle of the Coral Sea has also the distinction of really showing what the future of naval warfare will be like. Naval warfare, as we know it, is very much dominated by the before this, I should say, before this really, before this is really what shows, but naval warfare has been dominated by big ships. You make bigger ships and you fire at each other, kind of like real, like all the way back to cannon tactics, in the 1600s, 1500s, things like that. And this is the same kind of idea that is still happening all these, hundreds of years later. I mean, it's an effective strategy. But in the Battle of the Coral Sea, one thing stands out quite a bit, and that thing is the air power on sea. Both sides, neither of the ships ever fired on one another. They never even saw one another. They knew about them, but they didn't engage with them. All of the ships that were sunk during the Battle of the Coral Sea were by air power. And this is considered a big precursor to what will happen, obviously, in the future there. The the idea of a battleship, for instance, it's gone, and it's mostly in due part to the power of aircraft carriers. You can have a bunch of planes. Those planes can take off and do a bunch of destruction. Where a big boat, like a battleship, which is a kind of a sitting target, because it's a lot of times a flagship, it will be targeted, and it'll be a lot harder to fight off air power. You can fight it off for a long time, sure, of course, but eventually you're going to get overwhelmed by air power. It's just going to happen. I know they're talking about maybe bringing back battleships now. I don't think there was ever a full reason to get rid of them. I do understand why they did. It was expensive, and they were kind of sitting targets. However, that was also in a different time, you could say. A lot of the naval power now doesn't necessarily have something like a battleship. So we do rely on a lot of air-to-ship combat, but what happens if there is ship-to-ship combat? Destroyers can take things out, of course, and carriers do have guns themselves. They're just not necessarily the best for ship-to-ship. But a battleship could be your whatever, and you could also use them more sparingly. There were good instances of what they could be used for in case of emergency. The Japanese, for instance, would end up using battleships as defensive air platforms for their cities. They would put them on the coast, and they would try to shoot down air power, which is effective. I mean, they're basically big artillery pieces at that point. But it all kind of starts with the Battle of Coral Sea. Now, I had been kind of talked about before this stuff, with the Battle of Midway, the attack on Pearl Harbor, things like that. This really does show air power's strength. However, the Coral Sea really puts into a lot of perspective of the air power has taken over. Um, the U.S. almost loses 2 aircraft carriers in this battle. Um, we lose the Lexington, the USS Lexington, and the Yorktown gets very, very damaged, but it manages to survive, at least for a bit. And then you have a few other U.S. ships that are damaged. But then on the Japanese side, you also have an aircraft carrier that is destroyed, or very heavily damaged. And you have a bunch of other ships destroyed. And like I said, none of those ever saw another ship, besides, well, their own, of course. But it's crazy to imagine that world, how changing the Second World War was for a lot of military doctrine. You have that with both World Wars, really. The First World War really shows the obsolescence of many ground tactics that were used. You know, the marching into line with each other, or even sitting on an open field. It really kills that entire idea. And then you also have the destruction of cavalry, like we think of it, horse horse-drawn cavalry. I said horse-drawn, but it's just horse cavalry. Um, and then in the Second World War, you have a lot of the destruction of um, the naval side of warfare, where what we once thought to be very, like, oh, this is the tactics, gets very broken down. Most of it by the Japanese, really. They were kind of ahead of their time because of the limited um, restrictions that they had. But that's going to do it for this video. If you liked the video, please leave a like. If you have any ways I can improve these videos, leave a comment down below. I read all your comments. And as always, subscribe. It really does help out the channel. Thank you.